plane catastrophes of the Anthropocene, David Biello reports on in his book, The Unnatural World, are not natural forces impervious to human influence. That's a theme in David's work, and in tonight's lecture, you are not an asteroid. We have influence. We have power. We can reduce tragedy and misery through policy and law, social change and education, all informed by scholarship and science. Those ideals are what have brought many of us to the University of Florida, and they are surely what brought David to journalism. David is a writer of great humanity, an editor at Scientific American, the science curator at TED, and the father of a son and daughter aged 8 and 10. The New York Times calls him a brilliant young environmental journalist. But even better, the Times said of David's book, his writing maintains a kind of, and I quote, upbeat morbidity.
That was a win.
The science curator of TED may feel some pressure to give us a TED-like talk tonight. As a journalist myself, I know that this is not his want. So David, feel free to look at your notes, veer off script, and riff with all of us in the audience. We are thrilled to have you here.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you. Well, thank you for that far too kind introduction. I also felt that the New York Times aired on 2 counts. I'm neither brilliant nor young, so I don't know what happened to fact-checking there. Uh-oh. I'll wait. So I have a little bit of a cold. I'll apologize in advance for that. Is it too close to my...
I'm going to lower it here, David.
Okay. I'll try not to deafen you with ear-splitting shrieks. I have a little bit of a cold, as I was about to say, so if I cough or need to stop for water or a lozenge, you'll understand why. It's nothing personal. And without further ado, I'll dive into You Are Not an Asteroid, which may leave some of you thinking, well, duh, but actually, we've been behaving quite a lot like an asteroid. So this is probably the most famous asteroid in history. We weren't here when it hit Earth about 65 million years ago and reset biology that eventually, through the long course of evolution, gave rise to us. This particular asteroid was about 10 kilometers across, so not that big, and it plunged into the Gulf of Mexico, which was actually connected to the Pacific Ocean at that time. And it sent up a huge cloud of detritus and dust, and we probably, or I should say the dinosaurs probably had a couple years without summer, and that was enough to do them in. These are the asteroids that are out there now. You may think, hey, we're Vesta, we're big and we're bad. The one that did for the dinosaurs is about the size of 951 Gaspra. So it's not an irrelevant threat, the asteroid. But how have we been behaving like an asteroid? Well, the asteroid reset biology, as I mentioned. It also changed the climate. And that's what we've been busily doing over the last couple of centuries. This is an infrared look at our planet. I like it because it helps show how much hotter it's getting. The problem there is that it's in Kelvin, and nobody knows what Kelvin is, not even Lord Kelvin. So I will move on to the text slide, which sums up what is going on with global warming. This is kind of a long list, so I'll let it sink in while I talk. You can read it. We're behaving like an asteroid. We are changing the climate. And when you change the climate of Earth, big things can happen. So the last big climate change that Earth went through was the shift from the Pleistocene to the Holocene, from an ice age to the warmer period that we've been enjoying for the last 10,000 years. And that was a shift of about 1 degree Celsius. 1 degree Celsius is the difference between the New York City that I and perhaps you know and love, and New York City under about a mile of ice. That's 1 degree Celsius. We have warmed the planet by 1 degree Celsius further. So we're one ice age unit, if you will, further away from ice ages. I think that puts it into a little bit of perspective that enough warming has been put into the Earth system, the same amount of warming that ended the last ice age. And when you think about it, New York under a mile of ice, that's almost unimaginable to us, almost as unimaginable as an asteroid slamming into the Earth and the ramifications of that. That's the kind of change that we have wreaked. And as of course you all know, that has had impacts. That's a picture of a local favorite, a hurricane, a particular hurricane that you all probably remember. Her name is Irma. This hurricane and others like it has gained strength as a result of the climate change that we have wrought. The fuel of hurricanes is exacerbated by all the aspects of global warming. Sea surface temperatures, as that wordy slide noted, most of the heat that we have trapped on this planet has gone into the oceans. Sea surface temperatures are the fuel of hurricanes, so we're supercharging them. And then on the other hand, when you warm the atmosphere, it has more room for water vapor, and that's the other fuel for hurricanes, and in particular for the downpours associated with them. That, as you well know, here in Gainesville, is reality now. But it's not just climate change. This is one of our older technologies, spear points, flint spear points. We've made a lot of them. You can go to various parts of the world and find them in backyards and wherever you really care to look. And those flint spear points were enough to rid the world of these mammoths. Elephants used to be everywhere. I don't think humans widely appreciate that fact. There were elephants in Florida, or relatives of elephants in Florida. There were elephants pretty much everywhere you cared to look. And starting about 50,000 years ago, the great elephants of the world started to disappear. And those disappearances, while not firmly linked to human hunting, are linked in time to the arrival of modern humans. So humans show up in Australia, all the big animals start to disappear, not just elephants, but also giant kangaroos and other fabulous beasts. The same is true in Asia, North America, South America, every continent except Antarctica, because there weren't really large animals for us to get rid of. And if we're not careful, we will lose the elephants too. We may be the last generation to enjoy elephants in the wild. They are declining fast and furious because, as a legacy of there once having been elephants roaming throughout China and Southeast Asia, there's a fondness for ivory in those countries, and poaching for ivory has caused elephant populations to plummet. And one of the main ways in which we measure asteroid-like changes in the geologic record is through extinctions, large animal disappearances. If some future geologist cares to look, they will look into the rock record and they will find a lot fewer fossils of elephants all of a sudden, starting about 50,000 years ago, and a lot more fossils of cows, pigs, and chickens. So we're having our effect, and that will also propagate down through history. Evolution will be set by the animals that kind of survive our impact. But it's not just extinctions. We're also adding new elements to the rock record itself. This is a picture of the very first nuclear weapons test, the Trinity test back in 1945. And the very next moment, there was a new mineral on Earth, and I'll show you a picture of it. It's the little green mineral there. Radioactive sand fused into a new mineral called trinitite. That mineral did not exist on Earth prior to that nuclear weapons test, nor did plutonium and some of the other radioactive isotopes. Those isotopes are now spread all over the world. They're even in our bones and teeth. Those elements, as I mentioned, did not exist on Earth prior to human activity. And again, if some future alien geologist comes back and cares to look, they will suddenly see plutonium wink into existence around 1945. And they might wonder, who did it? So what does that's the kind of broad overview of the negatives that have brought us to the Anthropocene. And the Anthropocene is this idea that human impacts have become so pervasive and profound and really permanent, like the plutonium and the extinctions and the climate change, that we deserve our own geologic epoch. These are the different eras within the geologic record that denote periods of time when a particular animal or climate reigned. And the geologists are merrily debating whether we deserve our own, and if so, whether it deserves to begin in 1945 because plutonium is awfully easy to find, or is it older and should we peg it to the disappearance of mammoths and other large animals? But what does the Anthropocene look like for us? It looks a lot like this. If you look back on the Earth at night, another striking feature of the modern era is that there's light. That is entirely novel in the Earth's history. Other than large-scale wildfires, light at night was not a thing on Earth until we came along. And we have largely lit up the night and created our largest form of trash by burning fossil fuels. Now, of course, that leads to the extra CO2 in the atmosphere, as well as the lovely light at night, but it also leads to this, soot, or as the scientists like to call it, spheroidal carbonaceous particles, SCPs. Scientists always like to put a nice little evocative phrase to normal words like soot. This soot is even more pervasive than plutonium. You can find it at the bottom of lakes in the Amazon. You can find it at the South Pole. You can find it really anywhere you care to look. So the biggest marker of the Anthropocene may be a smudge, the soot that we've left in the rock record. And just to give you some idea of the scale, humans are great at making soot and trash. So some have argued that we should call this the Trashocene instead. There will be a lot more trash in the rock record than there will be us. So those future geologists, and these are rough estimates, as you can see, the future geologists will be able to paw through all of our middens and trash dumps and get a real good up close and personal look at what modern life was like. It will not be as easy to find us humans, even though there are 7.5 billion of us on the planet. So this is what the rock record looks like. This is what the geologists are arguing about. we will be leaving that fine little sooty line up there at the top all over the world. And that sediment is forming in lakes today. This is what the geologic record looks like. As you can see, the changes are marked by major extinctions. I particularly like gigantic extinction. That's when more than 90% of the life on Earth disappeared through a combination of climate change, not that much bigger than the climate change we may soon cause, and volcanism, widespread volcanism. Although, of course, the science is never settled on the deep past, and that story may change. Who knows? Maybe an asteroid set it all off. The asteroid extinction is there in the middle, the KT. That's the line between life before the asteroid and life after the asteroid. You can see that dinosaurs are there, and then they're not. And then up there at the top is us, busily working on potentially not only uncovering the past, but creating the Anthropocene of the future. And this is the guy who's going to decide whether we're in the Anthropocene or not. Jan Zalasevich. He is the leader of the Anthropocene Working Group, which is a subset of a very longly named international stratigraphy group. And stratigraphers are the most persnickety of geologists. They're the ones who look at these little lines in the rocks and decide, oh yes, that's definitely a change. Yeah, you can see a difference there, but it's not a big deal. So Jan is building the case for the Anthropocene, and in some ways I've just laid out his case for you. He inclines towards the nuclear weapons as the best marker of an Anthropocene, because that plutonium, like I said, will be really easy to find for those who look and never existed before. But there are as many potential interpretations of the Anthropocene as there are stratigraphers and beyond. Now, you might be asking yourself at this point, well, so what? So we're in the Anthropocene, and what's the big deal? Well, I wrote a whole book about it, which you can purchase in the back. And the reason I wrote that book is because I think the Anthropocene is an idea that maybe can serve as a bit of a lens for us as human beings to start considering what it is we've been doing and what we might want to change. It's an idea that maybe can allow us to remake our civilization rather than allowing it to proceed the way it has been. And I say remake civilization because we talk about saving the planet. And if you look at the geologic record, there's one thing that's very clear. The planet will be fine, with or without us. And the real problem is, it'll be without us if we kind of continue on our present course. What's at stake is not the planet, it's us. And I think that's perhaps not widely appreciated. We're the ones at risk, and we're doing it to ourselves. But that's also the good news, because it means we can change. And there are a lot of signs out there that we are capable of change, though you may hear many stories to the contrary. I put this slide up because in this modern day and age, we're not as familiar with the feathers and fur that drove kind of the wildlife slaughter of yesteryear. There was a time when here in Florida, the number one industry was hunting birds for ladies' hats. People loved their feathers in their hats. People don't love their feathers in their hats anymore, and we've invented other technologies to give us the frills and hats should we care for them. As a result, the birds, some of the birds, are back. And people don't wear as much fur anymore. Well, you could argue it's not as cold as it used to be, so maybe we don't need it. But actually, I think it's more of a social change. It's not as acceptable to wear fur. And these social changes kind of sneak up on us, whether it's fur or slavery or smoking. It seems to be just the way things are and can never change until slowly, through the work of committed people and passionate activists, it suddenly becomes less acceptable to do these things. And suddenly, overnight, fur isn't cool. You get ads like "I'd rather go naked than wear fur," and suddenly it's not cool anymore, and we don't do it anymore. And that's true for smoking as well. And that's a change that really blew my mind in New York City, because when I first moved there was no way you could possibly imagine a New York City bar without smoking. Now, there is no way you could possibly imagine a New York City bar with smoking. That's just 20 years and a social change. So I want to talk to you a little bit about some hopeful signs for a better Anthropocene that I've seen out there. And I want to start with one that delights all the fourth grade audiences I speak to. That's whale poop. It works for adults too. This is one of the animals, like many of the furry creatures that I just showed and the mammoth, that we almost hunted to extinction. And whales really served as the farmers of the sea, the nutrient pumps of the sea. They would feed and recycle nutrients, critical nutrients like iron, back into the food chain, so that the tiny little microscopic plants known as phytoplankton could thrive in some of the places like the oceans around Antarctica. And as a side benefit, those tiny little plants would be producing oxygen, which we all love. They produce about 1/3 of the oxygen you're breathing right now. But in addition, they bury carbon. And this is one of the ways in which the Earth's natural systems solves a problem like climate change. And so some enterprising scientists set out to see if, well, we've kind of gotten rid of the whales. Is there a way that people can step in and replace some of the function that the whales used to serve? And they sailed on down there to the roaring 40s and the furious 50s, and really the worst places in the world to sail, and essentially farmed the ocean, not unlike the whales of yesteryear, spreading iron fertilizer to see if there would be a phytoplankton bloom. And guess what? There was. The good news is that it works. The better news is that it also works to revitalize the ecosystem around Antarctica. Now, are there potential negatives? Absolutely. I think most of you in the Gulf region are aware of the dead zone that forms at the mouth of the Mississippi every summer, well, late spring really. That is a result of too much fertilizer, prompting too big of a bloom in a place where the ocean is not well mixed. And you create a place where there's no oxygen, and everything will die that cannot move out of there. That's not as big of a risk with iron fertilization, because these are well mixed waters. And we're going to need solutions to pull CO2 out of the atmosphere. Here's another one. Any guesses as to what that is? I'm checking to see if you're awake, because I'm going to ask you to ask me questions in not too long. Any guesses? Just shout it out. There is no wrong answer.
Taking CO2 out of the air.
You got it. That's an artificial tree. It's not as pretty as a real tree. I'll be even Klaus Lackner, the physicist up there, would be the first to tell you that. But this is a contraption that sucks CO2 out of the air. And we're going to need things like that because we're putting a lot of it out there. Now, hopefully, we can, much as we shifted away from killing animals for fur and smoking, it was good for our health. Guess what? It would be great for our health if we shifted away from burning fossil fuels. So, where are we not shifting away from burning fossil fuels? And that, by the way, is what burning fossil fuels really looks like. That's a coal-fired power plant in China. That is not filtered in any way. I'm not talking about just the plant, I'm talking about the picture too. When you go to China, the smog is so thick that you can't see 6 feet in front of your face, and it feels like you smoke 2 packs of cigarettes a day just from walking around breathing, so you might as well smoke anyway. And that's exactly what this man does. If you look closely, you can see the cigarette in his hand. He smokes like a chimney. His name is Fan Chongwei, and he is a mid-level environmental bureaucrat in a small city in China by the name of Rizhao. And this is the man who has been tasked by the Chinese Communist Party, the ruling party, with undertaking the experiment of, can China be carbon neutral? Now, what does that mean? That means emitting no more CO2 than you take in or otherwise destroy, whether through this wonderful technology we call plants and trees, or by cutting down on pollution, or whatever else the solution may be. So this guy is one of the heroes of our time. And you can imagine that if a country that relies on coal to this extent could clean up and go carbon neutral, well then it couldn't be too hard for us, could it? And another hopeful story. Anybody recognize this bird? This is not the hopeful part of the story. The passenger pigeon. This bird, we definitely ate to death, because we didn't eat it to death that long ago. 150 years ago, this bird was so numerous that it would literally blot out the sky for days on end. And in fact, settlers were so fond of it, they called it a movable feast, because you could just kind of shoot the birds right out of the sky or even knock them off tree branches. So we ate this bird to death. The very last passenger pigeon died in the Cincinnati Zoo in 1914. Her name was Martha. And she was the last. But I'm going to introduce you to a man by the name of Ben Novak. This is him, all geared up. Why is he all geared up? Because he's in a clean DNA lab. And his dream, he grew up in North Dakota, which, for those of you who haven't been there, is actually an excellent birding state. Not a lot of forests, a lot of prairie, but also a lot of wetlands and unspoiled wetlands. And that turns out to be great for birds. And so Ben grew up a big birder, and one of the birds that he learned about was this passenger pigeon. And he learned about these flocks of pigeons that blotted out the sky. And he was amazed to think about that kind of number of bird, because he didn't see anything like that around him. And he was also angry because he wondered how his ancestors could have been so foolish as to eliminate a bird that numbered in the billions. And he thought, well, you know what? There's technology out there that can change this. That is genetic technology. You may have heard of it as CRISPR. And it is enabling, potentially, Ben to resurrect the passenger pigeon from this. That's tiny. But that's a tiny passenger pigeon bone pulled from a natural history museum drawer. The museum drawers, all those furs and stuffed animals may hold the DNA that enables us to bring back some of the extinct animals, like the passenger pigeon. But even better than that, even if we never get there, even if we never bring the passenger pigeon back, that technology can save animals that are still with us today, like the elephant or the rhino, or closer to home, the black-footed ferret here in the United States. These are animals that have gotten down to such small numbers that they actually, it's kind of like breeding with your siblings or cousins. It's not great for your genetics. But the answer to that lies, again, in those natural history museum drawers. And using this technology, that genetic freshness could be re-injected into some of these populations, enabling them to thrive. And that's just one example of the potential that some of our modern technology offers. And I'll give you another example. There is a planet in our solar system that is entirely ruled by robots. That planet is Mars. which you might recognize. I'm unreasonably fond of this particular rover. I don't know, I've anthropomorphized it. It's an entire planet ruled by robots, thanks to our technology. And thanks to those missions, we now know what sunset looks like on another planet. It looks blue. On Mars, it's reversed. The day is red, and the sunset is blue. Our day is blue, the sunset is red. We now know this, or we've seen it with our robot eyes. But that technology is not just good for Mars. It allows us to keep an eye on this pretty little blue marble that we call home. And in addition, that technology that enabled us to go to Mars and to have satellites that circle the Earth and tell us about threats like Hurricane Irma also shows up on our roofs. Solar panels. That's a space technology. And you might notice the electric cars in the garage there. This is a super eco-friendly household in Austin, Texas, I guess. They even have multiple kinds of solar panels. And I just want to ask them, why? But I think they loved the solar so much that they got more, right? And what really gives me hope about solar is the unusual coalitions it's enabling, the unusual realignments in the way we usually think about the world that solar power has enabled. So you guys might be familiar with this image. That's Jimmy Buffett lobbying for you all, and I hope you did, vote no on one. Show of hands, how many people remember this solar fight? That's pretty good. All right. So for those of you who don't remember it, right here in Florida, there was a amendment meant to enshrine your right to have solar power on your roof, or at least that's the way it was worded. But in fact, it was an amendment put forward by the utilities, who are among the few people in the world who don't like solar power. Because guess what? Cuts back on your electricity use, and that means they get to burn less coal and make less profits. So they sponsored this amendment in an attempt to make it much harder to put solar on your rooftop. And this is something that has been happening all across the United States. The first outbreak of this solar war happened out in Arizona. And if there is a place on this planet that solar power makes sense, it is Arizona. I mean, it is sunny there all the time. When they need electricity the most is when it's sunniest. Solar power makes a ton of sense. And yet they didn't have it because the utilities in that state were opposed. And instead they had a giant coal-fired power plant, the largest in the western US, on Navajo land, which is a whole nother story. So what was interesting about that fight and the fight here in Florida is that it brought together people who love solar but didn't necessarily love it for the same reasons. So on the one hand, you had the folks who cared about climate change and wanted to reduce their carbon footprint, maybe even be carbon neutral, like Fan Chongwei. And on the other side, you had folks who wanted to be energy independent or free of the kind of oppressive thumb of their electric utility. I know I'm not quite very fond of my electric utility either. So this kind of liberal libertarian coalition, this green tea party, was able to beat back the utilities in Arizona and was able to defeat, at least for the moment, one, right? That did not pass. And that gives me some hope for the future. There is a similar fight going on just across the border north of here in Georgia, and that fight will be replicated throughout this country over these next few years. And that's where I see hope in what might be called the Trumpocene for a realignment of our politics, bringing together folks who don't necessarily agree on everything else, but can find common ground on something like solar power. And it's really important that we do that, because it doesn't matter what technologies are out there. It doesn't matter what, world-changing ambitions Elon Musk may have for this planet and for Mars. What really matters is the kind of, and Cynthia alluded to this, the hard work of us coming together as people and deciding what we want and what the future should hold. Should the future be one of climate change and dystopia and extinction? Or should the future be one that's a little bit brighter, where we do have animals like the black-footed ferret or the rhino or the elephant, and maybe even the passenger pigeon, where we do have a world that isn't racked by climate change and drought and flood and food crises, where we do have safe and abundant power on our very rooftops. And one other thing I would add on the solar front before I open it up to questions. What do you think is the number one predictor of solar on your rooftop? Any guesses?
Price of electricity.
Price of electricity is a good one, but not correct. You got it. Nobody ever guesses that. This is the first crowd that ever got it. Keeping up with the Joneses. So the same thing that drove furs and feathers and hats is the same thing that can drive solar power. The number one predictor is whether your neighbors have it, because then you see how cool it looks on their roof, and you like the fact that they don't have big utility bills or are energy independent or what have you. And that makes you want to have it. And that means that we can have a better world for the people that we really care about, our kids. And that's what this really comes down to. Like I said before, this isn't about saving the planet. This is about saving us and making for a world that is fit to pass on to our children. And with that, I'll leave you with a picture of my daughter and open it up to questions. And you better ask some, otherwise I'm just going to ramble on all night. Uh-oh.
Everyone, I'll just ask one waiting for you to come up. Please come up behind me to ask a question. David, thank you. That was wonderful. I just wanted to ask about geoengineering.
Yes.
You sort of talked about regional efforts, like there will be regional ways. We already seed the clouds and do all these various things.
Oh, the seeding of the clouds.
But what's happened, and even since you wrote the book, I think a lot has changed with the bigger picture of geoengineering, whether it
which I didn't touch on.
Well, not in this, but you did in the book.
Oh, yeah.
That's my question.
You want me to talk about that? All right.
No, just to say, where you think it is.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So so the whale poop is a form of what's known as geoengineering. This is large-scale interference in a planetary-sized system, right? When you think about it, climate change itself is geoengineering, but so is that dead zone at the mouth of the Mississippi. We do a lot of geoengineering, we just don't call it that. What we do call geoengineering are these technologies for dealing with the bad effects of climate change. And because climate change is getting worse, and because we're not doing much to restrain our pollution, geoengineering is becoming more appealing. And what's insidiously appealing about it, I think, is that someone like an Elon Musk, or even better, a Richard Branson, because he has the jet fleet to pull it off already, could, on their own, decide to mimic volcanoes. This is an idea that's been around for a long time, and basically it involves putting a bunch of sulfuric acid in the atmosphere. Yes, it's as bad as it sounds, to shield us from sunlight. So more sunlight would be reflected back into space. If it's bad enough, you get a year without summer, right? That's what happened after the big volcanoes went off. Krakatoa, for example. The goal here would be to put a kind of slight hazing all over the Earth to reflect away enough sunlight to kind of cool us off by about 1 degree Celsius. Remember, that's the amount we've already warmed the atmosphere, and that would theoretically shield us from some of the worst impacts of climate change. The problem being that there are all kinds of unintended consequences of that related to the ozone layer, but worse, from my point of view, politically, in that it's the kind of technology that can be implemented by a few and would affect everyone, whereas solar is kind of the reverse of that. It's a technology that can be implemented by everyone and affects only a few. Now, a very powerful few, and that's why we have a fight about it, but those are the technologies that make me nervous. And what makes me really nervous is that if we start doing it, and if we use that as an excuse, therefore not to reduce pollution, we will in effect have to haze the skies for as long as we care to survive as a civilization. Because if we stop, you will immediately kind of have all the worst impacts of global warming within the span of a few years or decades. We're already doing global warming at an incredibly fast speed, geologically speaking. But that is the kind of global warming that's just unprecedented and nothing we could deal with. And there is no project that humanity has ever been able to maintain that I'm aware of on that scale ever. And I'm not sure we're up to that challenge. So why not go for the regional efforts, go for the sucking CO2 back out of the sky, which solves the underlying problem and helps with things like ocean acidification and the other knock-on effects, rather than these kind of large techno fixes that may buy us some time, but will not solve the underlying problem. But there's been a lot of advances, unfortunately, on that front. People want to use it because climate change is getting out of hand.
One thing I thought was interesting is the discussion on kind of these relatively small wins in terms of solar power in the U.S. Mm-hmm. And I'm wondering if you can touch on some kind of larger wins internationally, especially in Europe, like in Germany, where I believe they're required to buy solar from just private businesses. So I'm just wondering if you can touch on some international success stories in terms of solar that you
Global
know of.
stories.
Yep.
Sure. Let me just take a drink of water because suddenly I have that horrible tickle in the throat that means a coughing fit is going to come on. So bear with me. Yeah, solar in the U.S. is actually somewhat behind. We have not done a great job of deploying solar. And part of that is because in other countries like Germany that you mentioned, there is incentives to, and it's going to happen, to require the electric utility to source power in that way. In addition, they have a lot of wind, which is also community owned, which is kind of an interesting model for here in the States. Here in the States, we've largely done it via the electric utilities. And that has led to perhaps a little more resistance to wind turbines than there is in Germany, where the local wind farm is typically owned by the local community, and therefore they see the benefits, not just the negatives of the wind turbines, but also the benefits of generating electricity that way and not having to run a coal-fired power plant that then pollutes their local atmosphere. So that's Germany. In Spain, a similar story up until the economic crisis. And really all across Europe, renewables are going gangbusters. They have a huge offshore wind industry, and as we are trying to build offshore wind here in the States, we're often relying on European companies. And as we're trying to build solar here in the United States, we've decided that we'd rather import know-how from abroad than develop it here at home. We made that choice about 10, 20 years ago, and now we have to live with those consequences. But I'm happy to talk about that more, off to the side.
Thank you so much for your talk. I was wondering if, when you're looking at the future of climate change and the solutions, do you see it happening more from the private sector or from the government and policy regulation?
I don't think it's either of those. I think it's going to be us. It really is going to be a political movement that solves climate change, if it indeed does get solved. Excuse me. Sorry. I'm going to get a lozenge, actually. Let's see if that solves the problem. Now, what does that add up to once there's a political movement? Well, yes, then government change will occur. And guess what? We'll move faster than government if the will of the consumers is there. Businesses, right? I mean, that's already happening in a place like North Carolina, where you can't even talk about sea level rise or climate change publicly. I believe that's also a problem here in this state. But you know what? They have data centers for Apple and Google because of the way the kind of data network is laid out. And those companies are sourcing they want to source their power from 100% renewables. Guess what? The electric utilities were more than happy to build in North Carolina. Now, no mention of climate change or anything like that. But you know what? It doesn't really matter if you talk about climate change as long as you're acting to solve it. So that's the kind of thing that gives me hope.
I have kind of a conceptual question for you.
Let's do it. Let's get
right.
conceptual.
Do you think that there's any danger in relying on technology to fix the problems that we have created, like maybe pushing humanity farther away from the natural world? Or is it kind of like, well, that's all we got to make this happen?
I think it's a bit of both, right? I mean, we want to maintain our relationship with the plants and animals and microbes and fungi that are kind of with us here on Earth and not forget about them. It's easy to get kind of caught up in tech world and live in the bubble of your iPhone and whatever else. But the reality is, this little monolith in my pocket, has more computing power than was available to the people who put men on the moon. And we're using it for apps, right? And tweets. But it could be a really powerful tool for politics, for conservation, for any number of things. And it is, in many ways, already being used in that way. But we can do more. And that's kind of the best case for technology. We need to kind of have smart use of technology. Maybe we're in our teenage years as a species. Homo sapiens is only about 200,000 years old. That's very young in geologic history. So maybe we're in our teen years and maybe we'll wise up a little bit and kind of use technology a little bit more wisely.
Hello.
Hi.
I was wondering if you could speak a bit about the economic origins of the crisis that we find ourselves in, and specifically how we deal with the fact that we have an economic system that profits from and has a financial stake in the continued destruction of our climate and environment.
Yes, that is a big issue, right? And one of the many proposed alternatives to the Anthropocene is the Capitalocene, to kind of highlight the fact. And if anybody really cares, I've got more alternatives to the Anthropocene than you can count on two hands. The Capitalocene is meant to highlight the fact that it was this kind of extractive capitalist system that brought us the Industrial Revolution and that brought us most of the CO2 in our atmosphere. And still, more than 80% of the energy that we use to go about our daily lives, everything that we're doing right now, is coming from fossil fuels. And our entire economic system has been built around the foundation of fossil fuels. So how do you go about changing that without changing the economic system itself? It's an open question, right? That's why I say politics is the most important challenge of the Anthropocene or the Capitalocene or whatever you want to call it. The hard work of us kind of coming together and finding common ground and finding a vision for what we want out of the economy, but what we want out of the environment. And I'm not talking about extracted out of the economy or the environment. I'm talking about what they actually look like. What is your hopeful vision for an economy that's, maybe more just? I mean, that's my vision, but might not be yours. More fair, less exploitative. I think a lot of people want that. They also want security, right? So how do we kind of create that shared vision and then work to create it. That's the real work of the Anthropocene. And that's why I say it's a hopeful idea, because maybe it's clarifying. It's like, man, we're like an asteroid. We better get our, pardon my French, shit together and do something about this.
Could you see us being in an environmentally sustainable society within a capitalist system?
I mean, it's awfully hard to kind of have green capitalism, I think. The fossil fuel industry is such a large, they're the most valuable companies in the world. It's kind of hard to change that. That said, there may be versions of capitalism that are safer and saner. Yeah, thank you.
And we do have time for one more question. And
Oh, you're the
person in
lucky,
line,
you
so-
win the door prize.
I don't know how to qualify my question. So
That's okay.
once you mentioned technology, I remembered your image of the Flintstone. Mm-hmm. That was technology.
Oh, yeah.
And then
Fire, too.
And then the layers that you had, I noticed the bones seemed like animal bones, but no other layer had the human being in it.
Yeah.
So what if, this is really provocative,
Do it.
what if it's okay if humans do come out of the picture? What would happen to the planet?
Like I said, the planet would be just fine.
Okay.
It's us that would be sad. And, maybe on that note, I'll leave it. But I hope we can be happy. No, really, I want a kind of more, the goal here is to create a world where life thrives, not just human life, but life of every shape, variety, and kind. I mean, that's the planet that I want to live on. And I hope you want to live on that planet, too.
Beautiful. Everyone, if you love the talk, you're going
Oh,
to
right.
love the book.
Yeah.
So
forgot
books
to-
are for sale in the back. Get your book signed. Ask David more questions.
Yeah.
And thank you very much for coming.
Yeah, that was just a small taste of what's in the book.